I well remember as a youngster, at least I think I was young once, school during recess. Now this was back in the 50s, so this wasn't like recess in 2013. This was recess in like 1957, or 59, somewhere back in there. We'd all get together and we'd play some kind of a game where we divided into teams. May have been touch football, maybe some kid version of soccer, or heaven forbid nowadays, dodgeball or some other kind of a game like that. Each team was selected by two of the most popular boys in the group. I mean, they wouldn't let just anybody select the teams. It was the popular kids that got to do that. They also were the captains of the teams. Of course, this was before the advent of inclusion and all of that, so those popular boys would choose who they wanted on their team. Usually, they'd choose those that were either their good friends or more likely those that they thought would be the most athletic. Well, I wasn't an especially athletic specimen back then like I am now. I could run, I could catch, I could throw, and I could do all of that. But I didn't especially excel in any of it. So I was usually one of the last ones that was chosen. And I'm betting that many of you can relate to that. When we choose up sides, as we would say, we always kind of hope that we would be chosen to the side that we really wanted to be on. And us latecomers to the choosing process often had to kind of just take what was offered at last. And that offer, even then, being somewhat grudgingly given by the popular boy, the captain of the team. Well, I well recall one day we took sides for a quick game of touch football. I was always one in those games that ran out for a pass. Why, I don't know, but I did. I never got one from the quarterback, who, by the way, was also the captain, who was also the popular kid. He always wanted to throw to someone that he thought was better, could make the play, or maybe throw to his friend. Well, on one of those plays, I remember this very, very well, everyone who ran out for a pass was covered by the defense. Everyone, that is, but me. You see, I wasn't defended because no one ever threw to me to begin with. Except on that day, there was no one else for the quarterback to throw the ball to. And so he heaved the ball to me, and I caught it. And I ran for the touchdown because there wasn't a defender within 10 yards of me. And ever after that, the defense paid more attention to me. And I was chosen for a team much more quickly than I had been before that catch and that run. And it was really kind of a heady thing to be on the winning side and to be a part of that win. Well, the story of the history of the nation of Israel has a place within it where choosing sides and being on the right side comes front and center. History of Israel, as you well know, permeates the Old Testament. Beginning in earnest with the calling of Abraham, the history of Israel is told in great detail in some sections. Other parts of her history are kind of combined into more general statements, and then some places the Old Testament just bypasses a good share of whatever history was there in those years. We don't know everything in Israel's history, but this much we do know. We know that God was intimately involved in that story from the beginning. His involvement was more than just watching what happened from the sidelines. From the beginning, God communicated with and he desired a relationship with the nation of Israel. Some of that communication was direct, as God and Moses on Mount Sinai, or perhaps God and Elijah. That comes to mind as well. And there's some other direct communication in the Old Testament as well. Some of that communication of God to Israel was through the prophets who spoke the words that God gave them to speak, not only to individuals, but to the nation. And then there are other types of communication. May have been through angels or messengers, such as the men who came to see Abraham and Sarah, or perhaps Jacob. And yet other kinds of communications may well have been in a dream, or what I call nudges in one's mind as he or she might ponder something. And of course, we always need to remember the words that God gave to Moses on Sinai, the law. That was God's word to the nation. The nation didn't always recognize God's attempts at communication, and sometimes even tried to intentionally distance itself from the hand of God, but nevertheless, God was not to be deterred. His plans for the nation were carried out. God's sovereign will was done, regardless of any roadblocks that Israel could have put in the way, intentionally or not. And we could stop pretty much any place in the overall story of the nation of Israel and see where God was involved, see where God was active, and see where God was loving toward his people. We're going to stop at one of those places this morning. It's not a long passage, but the truth that's in it is one that we need to recognize and I think apply to ourselves. But before we jump into that scripture, I want to give you a little background to the place where we're going to be going. Going to be going? As you may recall your biblical history, God promised as far back in history as Genesis chapter 3 that he would make right the terrible wrong that had come upon the creation through the disobedience of Adam and Eve at the hand of the serpent. I will put enmity between you and the woman, God said to the serpent, between your seed and her seed, and he will bruise you on the head, and you will bruise him on the heel. Well, in light of that promise that was given so long ago, God chose out of all the nations and all the peoples a man named Abram, later to be Abraham, to be the forefather of a nation that he would work through to fulfill that promise he made in Genesis chapter 3. He promised Abraham that he would make his descendants as the sands of the sea, and that through Abraham's descendants, all nations of the earth would be blessed. And as the story develops in Genesis and into Exodus, those descendants of Abraham found themselves in Egypt at a time when the Pharaohs, they enslaved them. And eventually, the text says, God heard the cries of the descendants of Abraham and delivered them out of slavery in Egypt through the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Well, they spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. The young nation of Israel had to relearn about the God of their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, after spending 400 years in Egypt. They'd forgotten much about Jehovah God. Many of them had turned to Egyptian gods. And in that wilderness, in those wanderings, God gave them laws to keep, laws which established a society, set the young nation apart from every other nation on earth. And when the time was right, they came to that land that was promised to them. There they waited until they received God's permission to enter. Moses, their leader for over 40 years, Moses has died, and he is not going to enter the promised land with them. Joshua has been appointed by God to take the place of Moses, and Joshua will lead the nation into the land of promise. And this is where the book of Joshua picks up the story. Remember, I said Moses didn't enter the land that was promised to the nation. Instead, Joshua was to lead the people into the land and conquer it. And the first few verses of the book of Joshua make this plain. And I'm going to read those first 4 or 5 verses, chapter 1. Now, after the death of his servant Moses, the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now arise, you and all these people, and cross over the Jordan into the land that I'm giving to the children of Israel. I have given you every place where the sole of your foot will tread, just as I promised to Moses. No one shall stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so will I be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. Well, Joshua, having seen the faithfulness of the Lord these past, 40 or more years, and after hearing these words from God himself, it seems, understands that God is with him, and he takes on the leadership mantle to bring Israel into the promised land. Now, this is no longer Joshua playing second fiddle to Moses. This is Joshua, leader and shepherd of Israel, relying on the faithfulness of God for strength and for wisdom. Joshua responds to the mantle of leadership by giving the order to the nation to prepare to enter the land of promise by crossing the Jordan River. And the people respond to Joshua just as they would have responded to Moses. And they swear their allegiance to Joshua, verses 17 and 18 of the first chapter. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, the people said, so we will obey you only. May the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Anyone who rebels against your command and does not obey your words in all that you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. I want to take a little side trip here. Notice that the leaders of the tribes spoke of God being Joshua's God. Only may the Lord your God be with you. It wasn't the Lord our God, but the Lord your God. Now, there could be two meanings here. One could be that the leaders were just simply referring to Joshua and God in a way that acknowledges God as being with Joshua. That's one thing. The other could be that they were saying that Jehovah God might have been Joshua's God, but wasn't necessarily Israel's God. I find it interesting to also note here, at the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua, perhaps in his final address to the people, tells them in chapter 24 and verse 14, he says, put away the foreign gods that are among you, which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt. This was after the conquering of the promised land. Apparently, Israel had carried the gods of the Egyptians with them across the Red Sea, in the wilderness for 40 years, into the land of promise. Many of them were serving those gods even after the conquest of Canaan, and even after they had seen and experienced all that God had done to protect them and keep them. Now, I think they didn't remove Jehovah God entirely from their lives at the close of the book of Joshua or even at the beginning of the book. They served him as well as the gods of the Egyptians. So I suspect they were doing much the same thing here at the beginning of Joshua. They acknowledged the God of Joshua, and they also, many of them, were serving the gods that they had brought out of Egypt with them. Okay, that was the free part. Let's get back to the main story. The account tells us that Joshua sends spies into the land where they stay at the house of Rahab. The spies come back and have a good report, so Joshua gives the order to cross the Jordan River into the land. They cross the river on dry ground, set up camp just a couple of miles from Jericho. Many of you remember the story. And then at some point, we're not exactly sure when this happened in connection with the rest of this chapter, that Joshua finds himself near Jericho. And evidently he's by himself, and there's something rather strange that happened. And here's the account from chapter 5 and verse 13, and it's also on the screen. Now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and he looked. And behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. So here's Joshua. We're not sure what he's doing there, possibly looking over the walls of Jericho or trying to figure out some way to, or the best way maybe to take the city, something like that. We don't know. It doesn't say. When he looks up and he sees this man standing there with a drawn sword. Now, my guess is that Joshua sort of immediately became a little concerned for his own safety, and so he asks what I think was probably a logical question in verse 13. Joshua goes to him, maybe not getting too close, but he goes to him and he says, "Are you for us or our adversaries?" In other words, are you for us or are you against us? Do I need to fight you or do I need to welcome you into our camp? Whose side are you on? And the answer comes back rather unexpectedly. The answer is no. Now, some translations will say neither, and that's okay, but the actual Hebrew, and I'm not a scholar, but I checked those who are, the actual Hebrew is no. Notice the man didn't answer Joshua's question. His question was, whose side are you on? But it's as if the man was saying, no, it isn't like that at all. I'm not here to tell you whose side I'm on. The reason I'm here goes far beyond that. We sometimes find this kind of a non-answer in other questions that we're asked in Scripture. These kinds of non-answers that are given, they're intended to break through, I think, so to speak, to the real heart of the matter rather than just dealing with the apparent. What was apparent to Joshua was, this is some guy here with a sword. I need to know which side he's on. Do I need to fight him or do I need to welcome him? That's the apparent thing that's going on here. Now, the man with the sword, whether he's an angel or a manifestation of Jesus Christ, I don't know. He's breaking through Joshua's preconceived ideas about taking sides by telling Joshua that it isn't about that at all. It isn't about taking sides. The man follows up that negative response, that no response. He follows it up with, I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord. Well, it didn't take Joshua long to recognize this man is more than perhaps just a man with a sword, but rather someone coming from God. Now, I think really it was a manifestation of God somehow because Joshua was, as we'll find out, standing on holy ground, just like Moses of some years before. And then the man and Joshua carry on this short conversation that's recorded for us. I happen to think there may be more to this than just what's recorded here, but this is the important stuff. It says, Joshua fell to his face on the earth, and he bowed down, and he said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" And the captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Now that's the end of the conversation as far as it's been preserved for us. We don't know anymore. I suppose we could add some suppositions to all of that and maybe fill it in a little bit. If we were making a movie, we might do that, but we're not. Notice that the man with the sword never goes back to answer Joshua's initial question. Are you for us or our adversaries? That question never gets answered. Now, I can just imagine, and I know this is kind of extra, but I can just imagine the wheels turning in Joshua's head as he processes all of this. And this sudden turnaround in his thinking from whose side are you on to I need to process what's happening here and begin to do kind of a turnaround in my thinking here. This isn't at all like I thought it was when I first saw this guy. Because you see, this isn't about sides. This isn't about choosing sides. This isn't about which side God is on. This is about God's faithfulness. This is about God's keeping His word to Joshua, that same word given to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Let me remind you what Joshua has already heard from God. I have given you every place where the sole of your foot will tread, just as I promised to Moses. No one shall stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so will I be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. And notice that God says here, I have given you. Already done. Finished. Just like earlier, we were talking about the war being won already. Dale Ralph Davis wrote a commentary on Joshua, and he titled his book, No Falling Words. Now that title came from a speech that was given by Joshua in chapter 23. In verse 14, Joshua says this to the people of Israel following the conquest of Canaan. Here's what he says. Now behold, today I am going the way of all the earth, and you know with all your heart and soul that not one of the good promises the Lord your God made to you has failed or fallen. Everything was fulfilled to you. Not one promise has fallen. No falling words. Notice that Joshua says that God's promises were fulfilled for them. Israel didn't fulfill God's promises. God fulfilled God's promises for or on behalf of Israel. It was God who did the real work, not the people of Israel. Joshua, in this encounter with the man with the sword, did indeed process what was happening, and he changed his tune rather quickly. His response says it all. The question about sides is now replaced by, what message does my Lord have for his servant? What message does my Lord have for his servant? This turnaround in Joshua's mind is remarkable. And it was just what God intended for Joshua to understand regarding what was coming. Not only for the conquest immediately ahead at Jericho, but for the conquest of the entire land of Canaan. This was to be God's battle. This was to be God's victory. This was to be God at work among the nations and for his people. Yes, Israel had a part in it. But Israel's part was not to be in charge, to be in control. Israel's part was to be obedient in all that was commanded of them. This was God's battle, remember. And Joshua sums up God's work and purposes in his farewell speech. We were there before, and we'll go there again. Chapter 24, listen to what he says. Joshua quotes God here. This is God talking. You crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. He's talking to the nation. You crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. The people of Jericho fought against you, as did the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and Jebusites, and I delivered them into your hand, and I practiced those words extensively. I sent the hornet ahead of you, and it drove out the two Amorite kings before you, but not by your own sword or bow. God makes it plain through the words of Joshua to the people who it really was who gave the victory to the nation. God wants Israel to know and to understand and to remember. It's not about choosing sides. It's about being obedient. So where does that leave us? What's this story? What's in this story for us? What are we to make of this small portion of Israel's history here? Well, you've probably never seen an apparition of some sort standing by you holding a sword telling you that taking sides isn't what God's all about. If you have, come and see me after services. I'd like to know. But nevertheless, I think that's one of the lessons here for us today. God isn't limited to be on one side or the other of some kind of human conflict. Whether that conflict is a conflict of ideas or a conflict of physical aggression. God is perfectly capable of seeing to it that his will is done without having to choose sides and without relying on humans to get it done. God chooses to work however he wants and is not accountable to anyone or anything for what he does or how he does it. I'm going to repeat that. God is perfectly capable of seeing to it that his will is done without having to choose sides and without relying on humans to get it done. God is not limited to be on one side or the other of some kind of human conflict, whether that conflict is a conflict of ideas or physical aggression. God chooses to work however he wants, and he is not accountable to anyone or anything for what he does or how he does it. He is not accountable to anyone or anything for what he does or how he does it. Our response to God when we're tempted to try to put God on one side or the other of some conflict that we have created should be the response of Joshua once he realized what the man with the sword was really saying. What has my Lord to say to his servant? That should be our response as well. God's answer to that inquiry may well have nothing to do with the conflict at hand, because remember, God does what he wants, when he wants. He doesn't need our help to do it. But rather, his answer might be something like this. Your community has hungry people. Feed them. Your community has neglected, abused, and unwanted children. Care for them. Your community has immigrants and refugees who are frightened and lonely. Welcome them. Your community has people who have never heard of me. Tell them about me. And most of all, love me with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. God has not already only told us what we need to be doing regarding these kinds of things. He has demonstrated these things for us in the person of Jesus Christ, who fed the hungry, who cared for the widows, the children, welcomed the lonely, the frightened, and told others of the God who loves them. Instead of our asking God whose side he is on, or trying to put God on one side or the other, maybe we need to say to God what Joshua eventually did. What has my Lord to say to his servant? Let's pray. Father God, we often are like Joshua, wondering whose side you're on, or we're doing our best to place you on one side or the other of some kind of issue or some kind of conflict. Father, we need to remember that you are on your side, that you aren't limited to having to be on one human side or the other, that you work your will in and through the nations and in and through your people. Father, may we always have open minds, tender hearts, to hear and obey when we ask you what you have to say to us. May we always, Father, emulate the life of your Son as we live and work in this creation. And above all, Father, may we always love you with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And may we, Father, always love our neighbor as we love ourselves. We pray this through Christ our Lord. Amen.